I said name and when and where you were born.
Oh, well, Bryan Jaggers. I was born on the outskirts of London in the county of Essex, and that was in 1932. And it's now Greater London. London has expanded so much that that part of Essex is just part of London now. So it.
What was the country like that you grew up in? What was the area like?
It was pretty much residential, um, older residential, and with new little suburbs popping up here and there, which where I lived was one of the newer suburbs. In fact, my my granddad was a master builder, and we lived in we lived in the show house that he'd built, and it was a wedding present to my mum and dad, and but the area was nice. There was a nice parks around there. The drawback to the whole place was that the Masters match factory was like about half a mile away, and it had problems later on because the Germans were quite interested in that place. But the whole area actually was really quite nice. But of course, as a kid growing up, you don't really notice if there are deficiencies, but none that I know of. I can remember, but it was it was just a pleasant place to grow up. Well, for 7 years it was a pleasant place to grow up, and then things changed. But and it was funny because 7 years old, you really don't know that there's a war going to start or anything like that. And the first strange thing that happened was that my my dad took me around to one of the local schools one night, and we got issued with our gas masks, and they were, I had no idea really what was going on. It was just something else that you wound up with as you got older. And never forget the gas masks, because they were the most awful things, because if you go into a tire store now, that is what a gas mask smelled like. It had this god-awful rubber smell, and not only that, it fit tight around the side of your face until you breathed. And then when you breathed, this thing used to go because the air came out of the sides of the gas mask. And so not a fun thing. Not a fun thing to, if you wanted to wear it any length of time. Of course, as a kid, it was kind of a novelty, but after the novelty wore off, I never ever wore it again, period, throughout the entire war. In fact, I don't think very many people did. They just carried them around with them. And that was the that was the that was the start of what my war was. We didn't have an air raid shelter, but my grandma did, and she lived, and that was my mother's mom, and she lived about 3 or 4 miles away in another little town called Barking, and my uncle had an allotment that he used to grow chrysanthemums and stuff on, because the cemetery was right across the street from their house. So they used to get out there on a Saturday and Sunday, and he'd sell the flowers off the stall in front of the cemetery gates. Anyhow, they built an air raid shelter there, and I still have no idea to this day why they must have had some idea of something going on, because we went down to my grand's house and pretty much stayed in the shelter from about 10 o'clock in the morning when Jerry started coming over, and he was bombing the London docks. which were only like about 5 miles away from us, so you could see all this stuff going on. And I stood outside there for a while with my dad in this allotment, and next to the allotment was a field where old Johnny Willers had a couple of horses out there. We got over to the shelter about 10 o'clock that morning, and about sometime later on, they started coming up. The Germans started coming up, and what they were doing, they just followed the Thames River up straight into the docks, so it was like an arrow for them. And of course, the London docks is a huge area, and they bombed it pretty much for about 2 or 3 hours. And where I stood outside with my dad, we weren't near enough, but you could see what was going on. You could see these parachutes coming down. You could see planes coming down. And you could hear machine guns and stuff like that. That went on, till about, roughly about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when they made the big mistake of, they hit the William Warren rubber factory, which laid a blanket of smoke right over that part of London and included, headed down towards the docks, and sort of obscured that as well. And they sort of became a little bit indiscriminate as far as their bombing was concerned then, and they were bombing around different places. Well, none of this stuff seemed to affect us all that much. But we just stayed in the shelter, which was good. And it was about 9 o'clock at night. We were down there, and all of a sudden you could hear this one plane coming over, and you knew it wasn't one of ours, because they had this strange. Their engines had this. They were sort of not aligned as far as their pitch was concerned, and they'd come flying over, and you could hear this thing going whoom, 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 and the guns in Barking Park opened up on this guy, and they were just a couple of miles down the road from us. And I guess he thought, so I better get out of here, but I'll get rid of these bombs that I've got. And he let them go, and he must have been pretty much getting close up to over the top of our shelter. And to this day now, I can still hear those bombs coming down, the whistle of those bombs coming down. And I remember my dad throwing himself on top of myself, my mom, and my gran, and these bombs hit, but fortunately they weren't, that close to us, but the whole shelter, you could feel the whole shelter move up in the air, and one of them landed in the marshes just behind us, which was a good place, and the other one landed across the street in the cemetery, which was also another good place to drop a bomb. But the only trouble with it was that when we got outside the next morning, my gran's house had no windows, no roof, and so that meant that we had to get something. Well, they had to get something organised. I'm 7 years old. I'm organising nothing. I'm just following along. But we had a lumber company just down the road. My folks did, and his brothers, and him and my uncle went down there, who had showed up to see if there had been any damage. And they went and got some tar paper and lars and everything, and did the windows at least. Couldn't do anything about the roof, but anyhow. So my dad went down, and so we decided that we'd just go down to see my uncle. who had bought a cottage in 1937 down in Suffolk County with 5 acres of ground, and which was just purely luck as far as that was concerned. So that's where we went. It was only about 50 miles outside of London. But when we got down, when my dad went down to get the car, he discovered that he didn't have a windshield in it anymore. That was gone. So my gran and my mom and myself, we all sat in the back. And so my dad was up there in the front getting full blast of this stuff. And then about 2/3 of the way down there, of course, it started raining. And by the time we got down to my uncle's cottage, everybody was pretty soaked inside this car. It was just a mess. But anyhow, we got down there, and there was some other relations that were already down there. So all of a sudden, my uncle went from him, my aunt, and my cousin to like 10 or 12 people staying in this 2-bedroom cottage, and everybody was sleeping on the floor and anywhere else they could find to sleep, you know. But once they got things organized, that wasn't bad. But it was rough for these gals because these cottages had absolutely nothing. There were these people living in London who had gas stoves, electric stoves, inside toilets and everything else, and these cottages had zip. You had 200 yards down to the toilet, which was a hole in the, you know, and if the water, you had to go almost a quarter of a mile to where the well was, and you'd bring up jugs of water. So it was all it was hard for them. And the stove that they had was an old, just a regular old stove that you chop wood and stuff. And mind you, had some good pies and stuff come out of that old stove over the period of years. But I remember my mom getting out there and sawing wood and stuff, you know, so we could get the fire going. But then we got quite modern. My dad ran pipes down to the well, and we had a pump down there, and so we used to pump water up to the tank instead of carrying 2 jugs up backwards and forwards. But we stayed down there, I suppose, for about a year. I'm trying to think, maybe just over a year. And we had one strange experience one day there. My mother and I were outside because it was a nice windy day, and we were out there flying a kite. And we had that thing going really well up there, and all of a sudden a plane came along. And this plane sort of flew past, and then he turned around and he came back again, and he flew past again, and then he disappeared. Well, we didn't tell him more. But anyhow, on the news that night, there was a government decree that no more kite flying was allowed during World War II. So whether that was anything to do with us, I don't know, but we were out there flying the kite that day. And so that was kind of an interesting thing. But where it got interesting was for quite a long while, you didn't see any guys down there at all. And all of a sudden there, the American 8th Air Force started coming in. And they were building the bases around that area. And funnily enough, my wife's cousin was one of the engineers that was building the bases out there in that part of Suffolk and Norfolk and Essex.
Okay, since we're in the museum, why don't you show me a little bit about where you were and the areas you were talking about there.
Okay. We were living around this area here between like Wormingford, Boxted, and Sudbury. Up here at Lavenham, there's a pub there that you go into, and I think it's on the ceiling. The American airmen had all written their names up on the ceiling, and it's still there. It's under a plastic thing now so that it doesn't get damaged. Up here at Thorpe Abbott's, I was telling you about Harry Crosby, and that's where the 100th Bomber Group was, up there at Thorpe Abbott's, outside a little town called Diss. And I don't know very much about any of these other places up here, but this was the area basically that I was living in. As I say, we were about in the middle there, and I used to cycle over to Sudbury and see those planes coming in. And the Americans that we got to know, most of them came out of Wormingford. And,
You're kind of working with the microphone there. I could hear that.
oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's just a.
You want to go back over just?
Yeah, let's go over that. Talk about how you were living around the Sudbury and
Yeah.
you
Oh,
bicycled
okay.
over.
All right. Yeah, I lived about halfway between these places. Sudbury, I used to cycle over there and see those planes coming in, all shot up. It was terrible. And Boxted was another place, but the one that we knew most of these guys from was Wormingford. And I guess looking at the map here, most of those guys were had P-38s but I had no real idea if they were pilots or whether they were just ground crew that we used to get coming around to visit us. But there was so much going on all the time. You really didn't know where the planes were coming from, out of which bases at that time. Except I know that Sudbury was the but that's I don't know. It's funny because I never saw those guys as liberators, but maybe they were. When you're 7 or 8 years old, you don't always recognize them, but I don't know. I honestly thought that I saw B-17s going into that base because the tailplane assembly was different. And because they may have been going in there just to land somewhere to get down, but I could have sworn I saw more B-17s on that base than what I saw Liberators, but
That might be something we might be able to look up later on and see
yeah.
about that, because I think there are quite a few resources around where you can still research what happened at various bases, and they might have had a mixture of planes at a lot of these bases.
Well, yeah, it could have done, but as I say, I don't remember seeing that many of them as I did of the old flying forts. But
were there any British air bases around?
well, actually, they were more up in Lincolnshire. That was where a lot of the English bases were coming from. They would have been up, more up around this area up there, and because when you look at it, it's pretty full of American bases. And this is Norfolk County, this area down to about here, and then this area comes down, and this is Suffolk. This is Suffolk, and then you're into Essex County down here when you get down in this area. But Lincoln is a little bit further up there on the map. And first time I ever saw one of those, I thought I was not seeing things properly. And that was down in Exeter when I saw about 3 of them fly over. Couldn't believe what they were. The general thing at the time was, well, maybe they took 2 planes and stuck them together, you know. But not much else I can tell you about that area at all.
That's good. That helps, I think,
Yeah,
a
that
lot of
really
people who
does.
aren't familiar with England understand kind of where you were.
Yeah, and London lays basically over here somewhere. It's about 150 miles from here up to Norwich. Oh, Glenn Miller. There's a monument to Glenn Miller. Not that they ever found him or anything, but it's a beautiful cemetery and a beautiful layout, but we went up there just the one time, just to see it. But a huge place, when you consider how many people are buried there. Because a lot of them really weren't. They were, unfortunately, never found. So we started seeing these guys, and they'd come by every so often. And I guess there was a problem. It was funny, with all the food that the American bases had, eggs were one of those strange things that all they got was, and I can remember them when I was in the army too, the powdered eggs and stuff. And these guys would come along and they would, say, can we buy some eggs off you, ma'am? This kind of thing. And anyhow, you get to know these guys, and they used to come round, and every so often they'd show up with a can of ham or something like that we weren't seeing, because our rations were such that one person was only getting like 2 ounces of butter a week, or maybe 2 ounces of meat and stuff. There was plenty of bread. Bread was pretty much available. Because we had a baker in the village, and so we were all right. But it was just the other stuff that was just scarce. But we were better off from what the people were in towns, because living in the country, we got to know some of the people around there, and they'd bring a rabbit down every so often. So you'd have rabbit stew or rabbit pie, maybe a pheasant. Or anything like that. At least we get a little change of meat once in a while. And my gran used to make them cakes and stuff, and they'd come in for tea. And as I say, bread was one of those things that we could get by with, and so we used to live reasonably well in comparison to the people in London. But so these guys would come down, and they'd buy the eggs off us, or they'd barter eggs off, with stuff, which was great, and we got to know these guys really well. And they'd just come in. In fact, one of them almost married my cousin. It got real hot and heavy, and but they were just a nice bunch of guys, We had one guy his name was Nick the Greek, and he was evidently a gambling person. Anyhow, all of a sudden he shows up one day and he says, where the hell can I hide? So I guess some of these guys were after him. So anyhow, he stayed down the road. We had 5 acres of chestnut trees that belonged to our deal, and I guess he was down there somewhere for about a week before somebody came along and knew where he was and said, "Hey, Nick, you can come on home. All is forgiven," or something, But so he left, but we used to get different relations showing up depending on how the Blitz was going on in London at that time, and cousins and aunts and uncles. But it was a pretty quiet war down there, except that it was B-17s, and that was the worst thing for those guys, because I can remember the weather at that time was a bit like Colorado, clear blue skies and stuff, and you'd see these contrails going over, and they were heading across the coast at that time, and I guess they would all meet up around that general area there and go across, and you'd just see these contrails just going and going and going, and then you'd see them come back, but not in the same organized form as what they had when they went over. And I used to go, there was a base just outside this one town of Sudbury, which was about 5 miles away, and I used to cycle over there, and gee, it was, I just watched these guys coming in, you know, and it was a mess, unbelievable with these. Well, what was unbelievable was how these B-17s flew with the damage that they had done to them. You know, you'd see them coming in with one engine absolutely missing and wheels down, and it looked like they had hardly any tailplane left on the things, and holes in the sides of the plane. You could just see guys moving up and down inside there, and then all of a sudden you get one where a flare would go up, a red flare, and everybody would start circling, and this one guy had come in and just crash on the edge of the field somewhere there, you know, just awful. And then they just start again coming in slowly, but it was just absolutely amazing. And of course, and as you got older, you suddenly realize that these guys that were flying these planes were like maybe 18, 19, 20 years old. The pilot was maybe 24. He was the old man of the crew, you know, and it was just absolutely amazing. Well, anyhow, I used to go and watch them, but that was really my experience with, you know, these 8th Air Force guys, the guys that used to come with us, come round to the house, you know, and it was just an awful feeling because you just couldn't believe what you were seeing, you know. The war that we were involved in, of course, was on the radio on the time, BBC. There weren't too many newspapers in that part of Suffolk where we were. It was pretty damn rural, you know. And as I said, there was no electricity in that house, so every week we used to have an old boy came up from viewers, and he used to stop at all the farmhouses, and he was the battery charge man, and he'd leave the batteries off, and so we had these batteries around the back of the radio, and that was our listening post, you know. It was the BBC, was information we got from them, but no, it was not good, and I could still see them in my mind's eye, you know, like, and I can hear those bombs coming down, and smell the rubber in the gas masks. It's still there, but you just couldn't connect somehow or other, you know. There were these planes, and you knew there were people in them. And it was just you know, when you went back home, it was just a sad feeling. You know, you thought about it for a long while, because we knew this one guy, Dave Eagle. He was from West Virginia, and he used to go out, and you never knew whether you would see him again, you know. But no, it was just, it was not a pleasant war. I had an aunt that lived down in Devonshire, and she was living in a town called Exeter, and that was in that same area down south or southwest where Jerry was doing a lot of his real heavy-duty bombing, where he took out Coventry and just bombed the whole town out, practically out of existence. And they did the same thing at Plymouth and Portsmouth. And they always reckoned that Exeter was a retaliation bombing, maybe, for what was done in Germany on some of these towns that were just sort of innocent towns that did nothing. Well, they did the same. I remember going there as a child, and it was a wonderful old city. You know, it really was. Well, the next time we went down there, he'd taken out a whole square mile of the place. There was nothing there, and it was just awful, really. My aunt lived. She lived about 3 miles out in a little town called Countess Weir, but it was far enough away it didn't affect anything at all. My gran was the one that did a good percentage of the cooking, because my gran had grown up using a stove pretty much like the old-fashioned coal stoves that they used to have years ago. So she was chief cook as far as that, and as I say, she used to make some great pies out of those. My gran was an experienced cook in many ways, because during that period of time when and I'm going back into the maybe 16s or 17s, when there was no food during that First World War, she used to get out and she used to net sparrows and starlings and anything that she could get to make some meat so she could feed people with, you know. Times were rough.
What did your mother do during this time?
She did all kinds of things there once we got to Assington, because she was chopping and sawing wood and all that kind of stuff, and carrying water up from the well. She also worked. When we moved to Lamar, she got down to. She used to work behind the bar in a pub as well, and so. I'm not saying she was just a housewife, because she did a lot of things besides housewifing, but that all ended, you know, when the war. And the funny thing was, when the war ended, my mother went grey overnight. It just amazing, really. But she was carrying that strain around with her all the time, and it just finally let go, and she just went grey. When we lived down in Suffolk, they used to send me up to the farm at night to go get the milk, and so I'd go off with my milk churn and, you know, in my hand. My mother bought a brand new raincoat for me. She used all her clothes coupons, and this was a really nice, really nice raincoat. And so I went up there. I was kind of proud of my new coat, you know. Went up there, and there wasn't anybody in the dairy. So I wandered back round to where, because I knew all the people that worked there. I wandered around to the cow sheds where they were milking the cows. Promptly walked in there, slipped on some cow's mess, and fell straight into the trough where the cows were all doing their business into this thing. And my nice blue raincoat turned green. So I saw this one old boy, old Mick Wheat, and I said, "Mick, can you clean me up?" You know, by this time I'm crying, you know. I knew what kind of trouble I was in. So he took me out and he sprayed me down with a hose pipe, which didn't help very much, except it sort of shrunk the front of the raincoat on top of everything else. So he sprayed me down and it got all the stuff off, but the coat was still green. I said, "Oh, Mick, what am I going to do?" He said, "Well, come on, boy." He said, "I'm going home." Unfortunately, he lived past where we were, and he said, I'll take you home. So I said, oh, will you tell my mum what happened? And he said, yeah. He said, I'll tell your mum what happened. So I said, oh, good. So we walked home and we went round to the back door. And he opened the back door and he pushed me in the back door and he said, your old boy fell in the cow shit, and shut the door and left. And I never did. You know, that was my mother just about had hysterics when she saw me. That was the last time I ever saw that raincoat. But, you know, that it never did get rained on. It got everything on, but no rain. My dad went back to London because they were doing fire watching around the lumber company all the time. And so it just left us down there by ourselves. He went in roughly about 1943, I think it was. It was a little bit later than the Blitz was. And he was stationed up in Catterick, up in Yorkshire, which is a miserable place. And he'd been a company director for quite a few years by this time, and he just wanted to get something, try something different. Well, he said about 3 months out there on the plains, sleeping under those trucks in snowstorms and rain and everything else, decided that he wasn't cut out for that kind of thing. So he applied to go back into the offices again, and they shipped him down south to the War Office down there, and they put him through some courses. And after he'd finished, they shipped him out to a commando camp just on the other side of London. And it used to be a race course before the World War II, but then it was a commando training camp. And it was good for him because he could just catch a bus, come across the Thames on the ferry, and then come home. So it was sort of like a full-time job away and the weekends at home every time. But the one story that I can remember about that place was because he was in with headquarters, and he was on guard duty one night there, and their idea of guard was that you just walked around and you had a pickaxe handle, and that was that was it, you know, no rifle, no bullets. And he said all of a sudden he was walking around there, and there was a noise in the bush, and a voice said, "Who goes there?" And my dad said, "Never mind that, who goes there?" And he said, this guy stepped out, he was all blacked out, and he was carrying a Sten gun, and he was all ready for bear, you know. And he said, "What the hell are you doing walking around with a pickaxe handle?" And my dad said, "I'm on guard duty." So he said, "With a pickaxe handle?" He said, "I'm on guard duty with the camp." He said, "And I've got a gun." So anyhow, they chatted around there for a little while, and my dad said, "Well, I got to get going." And the guy said, "Well, me too, I got to get going." And he said, "Come on, lads." And my dad said, I just about fell over. He said there were 20 guys all in the same black uniforms as what he was wearing in the bushes, and he said, you couldn't see them. He said, you didn't even know they were there. My dad said, I almost fell over. You know, he said, they could have done all kinds of mischief to me. And the other thing was that where his camp was on a direct route for V1s flying over there from Germany into London. And he said they used to watch these P-51s and Spitfires. They were all stripped down because these things were doing about 500 miles an hour. And they used to dive on them and put a wing under their wing and just flip them so these things would go back off out over the Thames, over the ocean. And and at one time there, because I was, as I say, I was still young, but it was the war had started, and Montgomery was going to do this thing at Arnhem, and I sat there on my Michael's pigsty that day, watching these planes just going, pulling gliders, just all day long. They just went on and on and on. Well, my dad was, he was watching them as well, and they go over, and he said all of a sudden one of these gliders detached itself and came down and landed in the front of the camp. So all these guys sort of went running out of the camp, and they were going to go across there when all of a sudden the door opened, and this guy stepped out and went blah, blah, with a machine gun. So they all dived down to get out of the way. And they were shouting, don't shoot, you're in England. And this guy said, yeah, bloody right, we're in England. He said, we know where we are. And he said, they could never convince these people in this glider that they've landed in England. And he said, all of a sudden, he said, regimental sergeant major showed up. And he said, he was a big old guy. And he said, what's going on out there? And he said, well, they won't come out of the glider, sir. He said, they think they're not in England. He said, well, oh, bloody well, prove they're in England. And he marched off across there, and a regimental sergeant major is usually a big guy, and you could recognise one of those guys from a mile. And he marched over there and he said, get your bodies out of this damn aeroplane. And he said they all got out and didn't say a word. They just, and that was basically about the end of their trip to Arnhem, which actually was the best thing for anybody, because it was a miserable thing. But anyhow, you didn't argue with the sergeant major. So anyhow.
Did you have other relatives that were in the military at the time?
Yeah, I did. I had my uncle that came round and helped us came round and helped my dad put up the stuff on my grandma's house. He went into the RAF, and then my cousin, he went into the RAF, and he was stationed on Gibraltar. He was out there. And then I had a cousin that was in the Navy, and he was in destroyers. Well, he got torpedoed twice, and the second time he was torpedoed, he was out there on the raft for like 48 days out in the middle of the Atlantic. And they finally, I guess he was on a raft the first time when he got torpedoed, but not for very long. But anyhow, when he came back in, he volunteered for submarines. He figured, and he stayed in submarines until 1950. But he said, I don't want to get sitting out there anymore. But and they were, as far as I know, they were the only ones that spent. My dad didn't, as I say, my dad didn't go overseas. My cousin was the only one that went overseas and went to Gibraltar. And my cousin's husband, he went out to the Middle East. And I think he was in the Air Force as well. And I can't remember much about him, but anyhow, I remember him saying one time there that they used to get invited into these different places by some of these rich Sikhs or sheiks or whatever they were. And he said that you sort of became careful about what you ate because you didn't know what you were eating a lot of the times. Anyhow, they took this new guy over, and he sat there and he was just enjoying these chocolate things. Oh man, he said, these are good, really good. And so anyhow, on the way home, they said to him, he said, I don't know what they were. He said, they were good though, really enjoyed them. He said, well, what they were chocolate-covered grasshoppers. And so I don't think the guy was too keen on eating chocolate goods after that. But yeah. But no, I don't think there was anybody else in that war. Most of my other relatives were in World War One, the ones that came home. But after Exeter and living down in the country there in Assington, we moved across the River Stour, in a little town called, little village called Lamarche, which was just a nice little place, and we had a cottage that overlooked the river and stuff, and we had a pleasant time there. But by this time, the war was starting to get kind of slowed down a little bit. You know, the Air Forces were doing their damage, and there weren't any bombers coming over hardly, except one bomber, one bomber. Where my uncle's cottage was, there was another cottage about half a mile away. And this old boy was out there one night. Why he was out there at night, I don't know. But he had to empty his toilet bucket. So he was out there with a Tilly lantern and digging a hole so he could empty the stuff in. A German bomber came over, saw this light, and let go a couple of bombs. And it was funny, they were talking to him afterwards, and he said, well, he said, I ain't never going to have to dig a hole again. He said, I got the biggest hole in the back of my house. He said, he said, oh, Jerry came over and did me a real good favor. And so whether or not he did or not, but I went over there, and it was a good sized hole, you know. So anyhow, but that was that part. About 1943, as I say, things had quietened down. And so my dad was in the army at that time, but my mum wanted to move back to London a little bit closer, and she bought a house in a town called Hornchurch, and it was not a good time to go back there, unfortunately, because all of a sudden that was when the V1s and V2s started, especially the V1s. They were the more noticeable but the only good thing about them was their jet engine made such a funny noise, you could hear it coming. And as long as you could hear it, you were okay. It was when the engine cut out, you knew you had about 10 seconds to find somewhere to hide or get out of the way, because it took 10 seconds from the time it cut out to the time it landed or came in. And one landed behind my grand's house. Again, the one where we'd been in the air raid shelter, and by that time they'd fixed the war damage people had come in, and they'd fixed it all up, made it nice. This thing came down, landed in the field where old Johnny Willers had his 2 horses, and they never did find the 2 horses, and it took the roof off my grand's house again and took the windows out. And she went back down to Suffolk and spent the rest of the war down there with my uncle down there. And we got, you know, you didn't get used to them, but you listened for these. This was this purring, strange engine noise that they made that you'd listen all the time. And we used to go, what we used to do was, the people next door had an indoor air raid shelter. So we used to go over there, and we used to live pretty much nights in their air raid shelter with them. And during the day, if you heard the sirens go, you'd listen for these doodlebugs coming over. And one time there, we heard it, and I heard the sirens go, and I said, come on, Mum, let's go. And what we had was a step ladder up one side of the fence, and then we'd go over the fence, and the next door neighbours had coal bunkers just there. And so I was up over and in, she said, go on, I'll be right behind you. Well, we were sort of sitting there, and the lady said, oh, here comes your Mum. And she came over, and as she was coming over, you could hear this doodlebug coming. And as she came over the fence, she stepped on the lid of the coal box there, and the coal box slowly gave way. And I still have this picture in my mind's eye of my mother slowly disappearing down inside the coal box. And she stayed there until this thing went by and cut out and blew up somewhere. And so she came out of the coal box because she was in a good shape and she came out of there. But the thing was that in the meantime, with all these doodle bugs coming over, every so often there were these loud explosions, and nobody really could know. Well, somebody could, but nobody in normal contact with people knew what they were. And what they thought at first was they were unexploded mines that Jerry had parachuted down. And then all of a sudden, of course, they realized what they were. They were these V2 rockets that were coming down. And they were, because there was nothing you could do about them at all. And it was kind of funny because you just went on. And by this time, I'm going to school about 12 miles away from home. And it was kind of funny because some days you'd go and the night before when you'd gone on a bus up to the railway station, there was a cinema there, and the next day morning when you went by there, the cinema had gone. They'd had one of these rockets land on it during the night. And the closest one that ever came to us, or came to me, was Christmas time in England. They have pantomimes, and they're a real big show in England. People take their kids to pantomimes. And we were in the Ilford Hippodrome, and we'd seen this one show. In fact, it was called Robinson Crusoe. And it finished, so we got up and left, and I was with the next door neighbor and her daughter, and we got on a trolley bus, and we were about a quarter of a mile down the road, and all of a sudden there was this tremendous explosion. Boom. And what the hell was that, you know? Couldn't figure what it was. Everybody decided it was a V2. And next morning we discovered was that this thing had come down, landed in the alley right behind the Hippodrome Theatre, and blown the whole back end out. But the thing was that the people on the stage just stayed up there on the stage singing, and nobody was hurt. Nobody was hurt, but these people just stayed up there, and they got the orchestra to stay in the pits, and they played. And all the time they're doing this, all these big old tanks up in the roof are all leaking, and water's coming down on them. Anyhow, they got everybody else out of there, and that was about, I suppose it was getting close to the end of the war. It was, you know, in the late 44, 45s. And I always remember I was over at my friend's house, and his dad came out, and we were patching a football, and his dad came out and said, "The war's over." And it was, you know, just one of those things. You just, oh, really? You know, what's going to happen now? You know, well, of course, what happened now was that the Labour government came in after Winston Churchill got kicked out, and it might as well have been wartime, because it wasn't. It was worse. We didn't have any more food. We didn't have anything. Nothing actually picked up again until in the middle 50s. Up until that time, they had ration books up to 1950, and it was not good. You still had one of the ration books for if you wanted to buy clothing and stuff like that.
And you spent a little time in the Army yourself after.
Yeah, that's what we're going to ask a little bit about your
Yeah,
experience.
I went in 1950. The Korean War was sort of going on some then, but we were only doing an 18 months national training service. And then once that war got bigger, they put it up to 2 years. And we never, the unit that I was with, Royal Pioneer Corps, we never went overseas. And at that time, there would have been two places to go. One was the Suez Canal, before they had the Suez Canal War in '56, but and the other place was Korea, but we never went. And a lot of English units did go. There was one group called the Glorious Gloucesters, which were fighting the Chinese at that time, and we met some of those guys coming home on the train at Christmas time, and they told us about the fact that you just couldn't stop these Chinese. They just kept shooting them and shooting them and shooting them until there was just a wall where they couldn't get over. And but I don't know how long they stayed out there for, but they came back. One guy, this Lance Corporal Speakman, he ran out of bullets, and he was just hitting them with a bring gun as they were coming over and smashing them. And I think he wound up getting a Victoria Cross, which was about the highest military medal you can get in the British Army. And but after I'd done my 2 years, I had a pretty nice job because I was the CO's driver, and I got to just drive around the country and eat well in the back of the officers' mess and that kind of stuff. It was pretty nice. But that was about it. I did my 2 years, and then they wanted me to volunteer, and I said, no, 2 years is enough, thank you. And then shortly after that, they broke the whole unit up. So I don't know what would have happened to me, but I didn't want any. The funny thing was, though, I was making more money in the Army than what I was in civilian life. But that was not not a big enough inducement to. So that was about it. I can't think of anything else.
I got a question. That's when did you come to the United States?
When did I come? 1958. Married an American girl who was teaching over there, and a strange story, the way it happened. This friend of mine had just bought a new house, and he wanted to build a patio. So he said, how about you and Mike, who was another friend of ours, giving me a hand to build this patio? And we said, yeah, all right, fine. So we went, and we'd go over there and we'd wander out onto these building sites and pick up all these old broken bricks and stuff so we could use them as a base for the patio. Well, Derek and I'd go out and we'd come back with a bucket full of broken bricks, and Mike would come back and he'd have 2 or 3 bricks. So Derek said to me, he said, what the hell do you think he's doing? I said, I don't know, let's follow him. So we followed Mike off, and he went around the corner, and he went straight almost across to where this fence was, and this gal was working in the garden behind there. And And he was leaning over the fence chatting away to this gal. And so we went over there and said, well, no wonder you're not getting any bricks picked up. And Kathy, that was her name, said, oh, he's been keeping me company while I'm gardening. So anyhow, she said, she got to talking to us and she said, what are you, she said, I know he's engaged, Mike was, he was getting ready to get married. And she said, how about you? And pointed to me and I said, no, I said, I'm not, I'm running free here at the moment. And she said, oh, she said, I'm having a party next weekend. She said, and we've got this American teacher that's just come in. She doesn't know anybody. She said, would you like to pick her up and bring her to the party? And I said, sure, I don't mind, you know. Well, that was the end of it. I got married 6 months later to this American girl I picked up because Mike Straker wasn't out there picking up bricks, you know. And so then I came in August of '58. Came on the Queen Mary, and got congratulated because Jenny and I were the first Anglo couple in that Fulbright teachers program that she was in to get married. And we got congratulated by the Queen Mother. It was a royal garden party, and it was funny because, you know, we talked to her for a few minutes, and afterwards we was down at the bottom of these long staircase in this place called Lancaster House, which is on the Mall going up to Buckingham Palace. And she came down the stairs. She was leaving. And she looked at us and she said, well, congratulations again. She still remembered us after seeing like 300 or 400 people in this garden party. And she said, well, congratulations. And she said, have a happy life and stuff like that. And she left and we're bowing and scraping, you know. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. But so then we came over on the Queen Mary and been here ever since.
Did you move straight to Colorado?
I'm sorry?
Did you move straight to Colorado?
Yeah, that's where she was teaching in Denver. She was in the Denver school system. And then we moved out to Broomfield, and she taught up at the high school as a substitute teacher for, seems like years and years and years, you know. But it's been fun. It's been fun. I've enjoyed living in Broomfield because when I lived in England, I lived 18 miles from Broomfield, so I didn't know that I was going to be tied up that close. But it's not the Broomfield that they talk about in the paper all the time. That's just a tiddly little old village, that place is that they're talking about. Broomfield that I lived by was an extension off of the county seat, which is Chelmsford. And it was, I remember you used to ride, you know, you go down the motorway now and you'll see signs that says Broomfield Hospital and Broomfield this and Broomfield that, you know. It's quite a much bigger place. And so, but I guess there's another one somewhere in England too, but I don't know where. But it...
I don't think most people here realize that there is a Broomfield in England.
No, I wouldn't have known if I hadn't been digging around looking for some information.
Nice, and yeah. Oh, it, as I say, I only knew about it because I used to cycle through it all the time when I was younger. I didn't take much notice of it. Oh, you know, you'd go through Broomfield and through Chelmsford and you were nearly home then, you know, so that was, but the whole area has changed so much now that all these motorways have been built over there that weren't there when I used to cycle around. I don't know my way around there. I go there now, and I don't even try and go back to places I came from almost, because they're all different. You know, except when sometimes going down into Suffolk, I'll go by my uncle's cottage. He sold it a long while ago and stuff, and the house is still there, and that was built in 17 something or other, so that was quite old. And then the cottage that we lived in, Lamarsh, just looking down on the river, that was built in 14 something or other. And it's a beautiful old place, you know. It just sits up there and just looks right across the valley. And I think if I was going to go back and live, that's kind of a place I'd like to go back and live. Not that I'm planning on going back and living, but that's the kind of place I grew up in. You know, it was just great. That's where I learned all my fishing. Was down there on the River Stour. You know, never used to catch much. I just catch a bunch of perch and give them to the old girl in the farmhouse up the way there, because she had a couple of cats. So, but that was, yeah. But the other places have just changed over the years. You know, the population has gotten so much bigger that it's kind of like Broomfield was and Broomfield is. You know.
I was going to say, we've done the same thing.
Yeah, because back in those days, when I first met you, there wasn't much of anything, was there?
No, there wasn't.
Now look at it. You know, it was 10 minutes into the country. Now, where's the country? It's all houses. Anyhow, that's about my wartime stories that I can think of.